Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. This is Carla and today you are watching part 2 of sewing a Basque waist prom dress. And here are the list of fabrics that I'm using for this project. Okay, so let's begin, shall we? So from the first video, we already cut out everything, so now we start sewing. Using my home sewing machine, I go ahead and start sewing the darts of my mono bust using zigzag stitch, as well as the princess seams. Next up will be the bodice pieces, and I will be sewing starting from the center front out to the side front panel. Practically just attaching the first panel to the second, then to the third, and then repeating that to the other side, and then sewing it all together at the center front. I then start sewing the lining for the bust section. Once I'm done, I then go ahead and press all my seam allowances away from the center front, because I'll be using all of my seam allowances as my casing for my boning. I then go ahead and top stitch 3/8 of an inch away from my sew lines. I'm pretty much creating a channel wide enough for the boning to slide into, but narrow enough to keep the boning from twisting in the casing. After assembling both of my back bodices, I then go ahead and create those channels for those as well. I also went ahead and attached the linen foam to my mono bust. It should look like this. Now I can attach my bust to my front bodice. I start by pinning them at the center front, matching the sides, and then stitching it 1/2 inch from the edge. And once I'm done, I then go ahead and pin the remaining bodices to the front bodice. And voila! So pretty already! Okay, let's go and press. Now I can start assembling the lining, which should be a little bit easier since it has less pieces. I start by pinning the front bodice to the bust, right sides together, starting from the center front out. Once that's done, I then go ahead and attach the remaining bodices, again, right sides together, 1/2 inch seam allowance, and press. So for the center front boning, I've decided to use a casing instead, and then attaching it to the front lining. And what I showed you is basically just me creating a stitch across the casing end. That way the boning doesn't just come off. I then pin it right at the center to keep it in place for when I do parallel stitching on both sides of the casing. And because this dress is for a client and I have to fit this on her before I finish it, I am going to temporarily attach the lining to the self, right sides together for now, 1/2 inch from the edge of the neckline. I'm doing this because I want to fit the lining with the self together as one and see how it fits on her. I also forgot to mention that the seam allowance along the neckline are also temporary. I'm actually going to be binding the whole neck part, but because I'm a little paranoid, I just didn't want to be working right at the edge, and I want to give myself a little bit of room just in case I accidentally mess up or the neck is too low, you know, because I can always trim that extra 1/2 inch later, which I will. So for now, we're just going to slash the edges for smoother curves. The plan is to bind the entire neckline, so after the fitting, I'm literally going to be unsewing the neckline and then trimming that 1/2 inch seam allowance. By the way, I'm sure you're noticing that the lining is a bit longer than the self. That's because I forgot to take out that last panel, but that's an easy fix. I can do that right after the fitting. Then I go ahead and insert my boning into that casing that I placed in the center front bodice, and then cut out the rest of the boning that I need for the rest of the seams. What I'm doing here is basically putting the boning against the seam that I'm going to insert it into, and then cutting it about 5/8 shorter at the top and the bottom. I then proceed by removing the casing off of my boning since I don't need those anymore. And to dull the edges of my plastic boning, I go ahead and melt both the top and the bottom edges. Once I'm done, I go ahead and insert all my boning, and she is ready for fitting. Woo! Oh my gosh, you guys, the dress looks so good on her. The fitting went amazing. Anyway, I already unsewed the neckline and separated the lining from the self, as I mentioned before. I also went ahead and installed button loops on one side of the bustier. Now I'm going to go ahead and show you guys how I do the other side. I start by placing my 1/2 inch Ridgeline boning right at the center back, and then stitching it right at the edge on both sides. And then from the top, starting from the 1/2 inch sew line, I go ahead and place dots or markers that are 3/4 away from each other all the way down to the bottom 1/2 inch sew line. And before proceeding, I go ahead and make sure I compare that to the other side, ensuring that they match. By the way, don't mind the misplaced dots on the left side because my brain wasn't braining and I messed up the first time, but it doesn't matter because now it looks good. Anyway, I'm gonna go ahead and place pins right at the 3/4 inch markers like so. I start by placing my spaghetti string about 1/2 inch from the top and pinning it in place, and then proceed by wrapping the spaghetti string around the 2 pins from right to left, and then wrapping that back around the second pin and then pinning it in place, and basically repeating that same exact process till I get to the end without getting poked. You see, there are very many different ways to do this, and I've tried some of them, and I just had to come up with one that works for me and that is the least bulky when I flip it inside out. But let's be honest, you know it looks good. Ooh, yummy. Okay, let's go parallel stitch this in place. Yes, queen! Look how good she looks already! Ah! Okay, now I'm attaching the lining again, but this time for real. We're gonna go ahead and pin that right along the center back on both sides, and then stitch them 1/2 inch from the edge. Once I'm done, I go ahead and flip it inside out, and it should look something like this. And now on to the skirt. Okay, so a lot of you guys saw the short version of this video, and quite a few of you asked about my draping technique. And honestly, it's nothing special. It's something I also learned from a previous designer boss that I used to work for, and then adding my own flair to it. What it is basically just me pulling from one of the selvage edges and ensuring that as I am doing that, as you can see, I am making sure that both edges of that selvage is touching the floor. And while I'm doing that, I'm also simultaneously double checking the width of the fabric, making sure that that part of it is also touching the floor. Oh, and I forgot to film the part where I measured the height of the mannequin. I did that before I started draping, just FYI. And I also added an extra inch on the height just to give me some room to play around in case I mess up. And it's always better to have extra fabric that I can just trim later. Anyway, what I'm doing now is basically gathering the skirt right at the waist. I'm also draping it 1 panel at a time. So my skirt should have a total of 10 panels. So right now I'm working on one of the center front panels, and then pinning it at the new waistline that I created with the style tape. And once I'm happy with it, I go ahead and double check again, making sure that everything's covered, everything's touching the floor as far as the edges go, and then I go ahead and cut. while Ocean stares at me, of course. And again, I basically just repeat the same exact process and then repeat it again to the next panel and the next one after that, and so on. So yeah, it's pretty simple actually, and also really time efficient too, so that's definitely another plus. Not unless you're doing like some sort of mass production, then you know, you would go off with a pattern. But for something that's one off or custom like this dress, this is definitely a way to go. And another thing I love about this technique is that I have more control of how much gather I want, and I get to see how it looks instantly. And if I don't like it, I can always adjust it. Like for this one, I wanted to add more gathers, but with our budget, yeah, we could only do 50 yards, and I thought it was fine too, since I'm gonna line it anyway, so yeah. And once I'm done and happy with my drape, I go ahead and cut all the excess fabric. I'm only leaving about 1/2 inch seam allowance, so I'm just gonna cut it one panel at a time. There you go. Now I'm ready to sew. We'll go ahead and start at the center front seam. And because I am a serial pinner, I'm gonna go ahead and pin before I sew, of course, all the way down to the hem. And as you can see, I intentionally left the selvage edges on there. It's something I like to do because it helps me see it better, especially with tulle. It can be quite challenging sometimes to see. So yeah, I basically just sew about 1/4 to 1/2 inch away from that finished edge, and then just trim the excess and leave about 1/4 inch seam allowance. And that's what's nice about tulle, because it doesn't fray, so you don't really need a lot of seam allowance there, and you don't need to overlock as well. And another thing that I do after is to true the waistline, just to clean it all up, and this also makes it less challenging for me to gather the waist later. And again, after that, literally repeating the same exact process to the rest of the panels except for the center back, because we're gonna have to leave about 10 inches opening there for my client to get in and out of the dress. With that said, I'm trying to keep this video short and sweet for you guys, so I'm not gonna show the rest of the video of me sewing 10 skirt panels. So yeah, once I'm done putting together the skirt, I go ahead and gather the waist. And yes, I am doing this freehand, not base stitching whatsoever, just doing the thing because it's a rush order, and yeah. You know, we gotta do what we gotta do. But are you ready to see it? 3, 2, 1. Dun dun dun. So pretty. Okay, now moving on to the lining. So I'm just gonna fold this on the bias. Like so. So I'm not gonna need, I won't be needing the selvage part. So when I fold it, I'm gonna just consider that edge is gone, because I'm gonna be trimming that edge to here, if that makes sense. So I'm just folding it like so, all the way to the end. So this should be like a huge triangle, or a huge square folded into half along the bias, right? So I'm just gonna do this side, trying my best to keep it all even, front and back. I don't know if you could tell, but I also pinned the 2 layers at the edge along the selvage line, since I am draping this 2 layers as one. I then go ahead and trim some of the excess fabric at the waist. And once I'm ready, I go ahead and trace my style line and transferring my markings onto my fabric. Then I proceed and cut my 1/2 inch seam allowance. And then move on to the hem. But first I gotta say a little prayer because I just can't afford to mess this up right now, and I'm gonna freehand this. And it's currently past 10 p.m. and tonight is my only night to work on this lining because I'm fitting this in a couple days, so fingers crossed. I did it. Okay, it looks fine. Except okay. Woo! We're good. We're good. Okay. So if you look at the length now, it looks pretty perfect. Looks good. But let me open it up so you get an idea what it looks like. Open. Yeah, it's pretty good. Cool. Now let's do the back. So for the back, it's pretty much the same concept as the front skirt, except we're gonna need a center back seam. And just like the front, I am folding the fabric on the bias and then making sure I'm lining up the cut edge about 3/4 of an inch from the factory edge, or what we call the selvage. And then cutting it along the bias line because that's gonna be our center back seam. I'm also gonna cut out the rest, including the selvage edge. Now we can drape. And I'm gonna go ahead and start draping the right back skirt, again, using the bias line as our center back seam. Then I'm going to cut out the excess fabric at the waist and start draping it on the mannequin. I then go ahead and transfer my markings. And for the back, since the corset is a lace-up, I'm gonna go ahead and have my center back end at this angle to meet the bodice, and then just add a flap later on to cover that part of the back skirt. And then I go ahead and cut. Now for the left side of the back skirt, I'm just gonna go ahead and use the panel I just did, lay that on top, right sides together, and then use it as a pattern. Keeps it symmetrical, you know? So for the center back opening, I know I traced that V mark on there, but I haven't cut it yet because I wanted to do that after I attach the bodice to the skirt. So for now, I'm gonna go ahead and sew the center back seam, starting from the bottom of that V down to the hem. Next up would be the side seams, again pinning them right sides together and then sewing them 1/2 inch from the edge. And once I'm done, I go ahead and overlock my seam allowance and then press. Now I can see it together, kind of. One of my favorite parts. I get to attach the tulle to the lining, so I'm going to do that on the mannequin, just because it's easier. Then I go ahead and base stitch the two together. Once I'm done, I just put it back on the mannequin just to keep it from wrinkling, and then I work on my bodice once again. So I just want some drape tulle detail on this bustier, so at this point I'm literally just playing around and seeing where it takes me, honestly. So yeah, I just started by grabbing a yard of tulle and then gathering it right at the center along the grain line, and then pinning the gathers in place right along the center front bust first, and then along the side seams. And then I just cut out any excess material I don't need. And since I'm pretty happy with it, I'm just gonna go ahead and hand sew the ruching in place right at the center front bust. Then I went ahead and grabbed another piece of tulle, wide enough that would fit the panel that I'm working on, and then just ruched away. Again, I'm just playing around with this, trying to see what looks good and what doesn't, and if I like it. And once I'm done with it, I go ahead and steam it so it's not so bunchy. And then hand stitch the ruching in place. I then proceed by cutting the excess fabric. And then hand stitching the ruching at the waist. So for this piece, the same thing, I grabbed another tulle and then just played around with it. And as I'm doing this, by the way, I'm realizing that I'm really hating how that side bust looks. It just looks so sloppy, but it's okay. So I'm just gonna work on this side and then modify it later. I also went ahead and steamed it and just forgot to film it, and then moved on to the other side. Now I'm going to go ahead and trim all the excess fabric. And since that side bust ruching is really bothering me, I'm going to go ahead and unpin some of the layers to fix it. So, not necessarily changing the design or anything like that. I'm just switching up the layers at this point. So that drape that I did from the waist up to the back, I'm just gonna put that under and then make the bust piece the outermost layer instead. I'm also gonna go ahead and regather it and make it look a little bit more pleasant than what it looks now. So yeah. Now look at that, it looks way better already, right? All right, let's do it to the other side. Now all I have to do is hand stitch all the ruching that I did in place. Also, I'm using a clear thread to do all the hand stitching. That way the stitches aren't so visible. After a full day of hand sewing, I'm gonna go ahead and prepare my elastic binding to place onto the neckline. So I'm gonna use the wrong side of the binding, which is the least shiny part. So I fold it wrong sides together, stitch it across like so, and then flip it inside out. And then just slip my neckline into it and then stitch it right on the edge of the binding. As I'm sewing, by the way, I'm also pulling the binding about maybe 30%. So I'm kind of stretching it a little bit to prevent the neckline from gaping, especially because this is strapless. After that, I'm now going to attach the bodice to the skirt. Wow! I am so excited at this point. I just can't wait to start sewing my appliques onto it. So yeah, basically pinning it together, starting from the center front first, and then the side seams, and then pinning the rest of the waist seam. Once I'm done, I then go ahead and cut out my appliques. By the way, huge shout out to my boyfriend and his roommate for helping me cut out some of the appliques, because there was about a yard of this that I had to cut out, and we filmed it, but I can't seem to find the video. So thank you, Bruce and Georgina. Oh my gosh, I'm so excited to do this part. I can't tell you guys how much I enjoy hand sewing for some reason, especially appliques. I don't know, it's just really therapeutic for me. By the way, just placing my appliques took about a couple hours because I had to play around with it a little bit and come up with a design that would flatter my client the most. And yeah, what you're looking at is the final design that I've decided on. And once I'm done, I go ahead and hand sew those appliques away. This would take about maybe 6 to 8 hours. So this is the time when, you know, I listen to my podcast or watch a favorite show. More like listen, really. So yeah, so calming. I love it. And oh my goodness, I almost forgot about the shoulder pieces. So I practically just grabbed a rectangular piece of fabric or tulle and folded it into 3, did a couple pleats on both ends, and then attached it to the bodice. And of course I made 2 identical ones, so yeah, this took about like not even 5 minutes. Although I did forget to film the part where I attach it and hand sew more appliques on it. However, dress reveal in 3, 2, 1.